Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we get going again. Our next speaker is Heidi Waterhouse, again, an international speaker who has come to us, who is going to be speaking about search-first writing for developers. Thank you very much, Heidi.
Good morning, I think. I started my day in Minneapolis, so I'm not entirely sure what time it is anymore. And I've always wanted to tell this joke, so I just flew in from the US, and boy, are my arms tired. Go on. It's not many times you get a chance to do that. So I'm here to talk to you today about search-first writing for developers. And this is a talk that I've written specifically for developer conferences because I'm a technical writer and you all are not doing it right. Sorry. I don't mean to be judgy, but this is the end of my presentation, so I'm going to suavely skip through a whole bunch of slides. Sorry. This is what I get for duplicate. Yeah. There should be a start over because I'm a dummy setting, but look at all these slides. Are you guys ready? I talk really fast, so it's going to be okay. It's like a preview. Yeah, exactly. It's the trailer. So I've put on here a hashtag. If you guys are tweeting about it, I'd really appreciate you using the hashtag. It allows me to find it and storify it later so that people can find it. And that's super useful. All right, so now you're going to advance, right? When we use software, we are trying to accomplish a goal. It's not that we actually enjoy using software. We're just trying to fix a problem or find an ATM or catch a leafy on. So if we're using software, we're not really thinking about the software. But that doesn't mean we don't have feelings about it. It's just that frequently our feeling is like, we don't really care. Once in a while, you'll meet software that makes you feel like this. Like, I feel like this reading the Slack release notes. They delight me. They're just so charming. But most of the time, you're not going to feel like that about software. Mostly, the emotion that we notice is like, bleh. Oh, it's not letting me do what I want. Excel believes that's not a date, but a number, whatever it is. The emotion we notice most is this emotion. This is how we feel about software that blocks us from doing what we want to do. We are trying to do something here, people, and your software is getting in my way, and why has it crashed, or why isn't it working? Here's my deep, dark secret as a technical writer. Nobody likes reading documentation. I don't like reading documentation. If I had wanted to read documentation, I would not have been a technical writer who writes it. See, I never have to read it because it doesn't exist yet. It's great. It's totally a feature. But reading documentation improves our skills, and it's not rewarding in the moment. Unlike a dog that steals something off the counter, it's immediately rewarded. We are not immediately rewarded for reading documentation. But it does teach us a lot of important things. Sadly, most of the time when people come to documentation, they are already angry. Like, this is my secret as a technical writer. Anybody who's reading documentation has already failed at using the software, and they are already angry. They are looking for help because they were trying to do a thing. They were trying to catch their leafy on or find an ATM or munge their data, and it's failed. So they're angry. And you know what? Lots of documentation is trying to be cute. I worked for the most boring software company on earth. We made a platform that sat on top of IBM WebSphere MQ and did message queue monitoring. The software was based on, I kid you not, sewage monitoring, like back in the dawn of time. It turns out that queues of messages and queues of poop are essentially indistinguishable if you're software. This company had named the product QPasa with an exclamation mark that was part of the branding. And all of our bullet points were adorable little chili peppers. In the 5 years I worked for that company, nobody I ever talked to was charmed by the chili peppers. They were mostly angry because they were using software and reading documentation. So what makes reading documentation better? What makes it better is getting the answer you need at the time you need it so you can do your thing. there's an art to giving people that answer, and I'm going to teach it to you really fast because I'm good at this. About 10% of developers like writing documentation. They exist. A large percentage of them are German, and I don't understand why, but if you've ever worked with a German, they're like, they're like meticulous documenters. Like something about the school system or something. And this room is going to be biased toward developers who like writing documentation because you didn't flee from the very title that involved writing. But only about 10% of developers like writing documentation. And here's why you should do it. It saves you from answering the same question over and over and over and over again, which nobody loves. The other thing it saves you from is burnout. I was talking to Eric Holscher, who runs Read the Docs, and a conference called Write the Docs, which I love dearly. But Read the Docs is supporting some huge players in open source, and he's running it single-handed because he can't find enough money. So every time he can document something and take a support burden off, it makes it possible for him to do more development on it. I think you should all give Read the Docs more money, but I also think you should think about how every time you write documentation, you are saving yourself from burnout. So, how to write documentation? Let me give you a pitch first. Professionals get paid for domain-specific knowledge. There are thousands of technical writers in the world, and even a few dozen as good as me. We can design your documents, analyze your audience, use our special mystical tech writing tools, and turn out a shiny professional set of documentation for you in less time than you would believe possible that make you look enterprise grade even if you're 5 people in an incubator. The best way to get top-notch documentation is to hire someone like me and not waste developer time doing something that is not in their domain experience. But for most technical writers, the pay scale is about the same as a Java developer of equivalent experience, like just, you know. And even if we have to learn your software, it takes us much less time because we don't have to learn how to write English. And I love you all, but not always your most beautiful skill. But who can afford that, right? Like, can you add another developer to your project right now? Or somebody who costs as much as a developer? Probably not, lots of you. You're on small projects, or you're on love projects, or you're in a team that isn't structured to have a full-time writer, and probably you don't have quite enough work for a full-time writer. So if you can't afford it, here's what we're gonna do. You're gonna have to write your own documentation, or get your developers to do it, and I'm gonna tell you how to do it as painlessly as possible, which is not to say no pain, but suffering. It's good for the soul. Figure out what questions people are actually asking. You need to think about what your users are asking to understand and what is making them make that angry emoticon. If you don't have users, find some people who are like your projected users and set them up as target users. If you don't have a profile and persona for a target user, stop. Writing documentation is not your problem. Back up and figure out who you're going to sell this to. Because you've got bigger problems than documentation if you don't know who your user is. So, ask your users what they're trying to do with your software. Don't assume that you know what they're trying to do with your software, because what a developer does with their software is almost entirely different than what a user is going to do with the software. The Venn diagram overlap on that is extremely small, weirdly enough. Watch them use your product and figure out what they're struggling with. And this only works if you don't help them, if you find out where their pain points are. If your product is accessible somehow, find out where the users are talking to each other. I find it super useful to go to Stack Overflow and find out what the common questions are and whether or not they've actually gotten answered, and then I steal those answers back. There might be an IRC channel. There might be a Slack channel. There might be a well-traveled physical bulletin board in the hallway where people post questions and answers. Whatever it is, you have to find out where the users are talking to each other. and collect those questions and do a rough frequency analysis on it so you know what's confusing people. If you have anyone doing support, they are also an invaluable resource. They know what they're answering all day. Get into your support metrics and find out how many times a day they are answering the same question, and use that as a contribution to the stack of questions that you're collating. So hopefully you have a huge list of questions now. You have like this stack of things that people are confused by, and you've sort of sorted them roughly into categories like people are confused by onboarding, people are confused by configuration. Take it down to 20 questions. 20 questions. If you can answer 20 questions, here's the deal. Fun fact, the normal distribution works on lots of things. If you answer the 20 questions out of 100 confusing things about your product, you are serving the vast majority of your users. The 80-20 idea of centering your focus not on the edge cases, but on the most common problems. I think as nerds, we have a fascination with the long tail and the edge case and the weird outside things, but that's not actually helping people who need to use your stuff. So, analytics. Stop and set up analytics on whatever you're doing. You want to be able to see where people are going, what they're asking, and how often they're getting their questions answered. So right now, you're just going to set it up. It's just going to sit there for a little bit. We'll talk about part 2 in a minute. Now you have 20 questions. Answer those questions in a way that people can find and use. You have to answer the actual question that they're asking as it affects function and not the way they ask it. Because if you've ever worked support, you're painfully aware that the way a user asks a question and the way you're going to be able to answer it are sometimes widely divergent. It doesn't hurt to do both, to use the language that someone has used to ask the question and to answer it in your language, but you can't do only one. Next, you need to make your answers findable. One of the things I've learned over the years is that what your users call something and what you call something is widely divergent. But if you want to serve them, you're going to have to use the terms that they're using. Who recognizes this? For years, Microsoft would give you this error when you had this screen when you had a fatal error. Everyone who worked with Windows recognized it and knew what was happening, and we all called it the blue screen of death. But when you searched on Microsoft's help, there was no blue screen of death entry. It didn't tell you what you were looking at. They've added it now. It's now a searchable term. If you search on blue screen of death, it will take you to the fatal error page. But for years, that wasn't true. And so you'd hit this thing, and your administrator would go, oh, yeah, you got a blue screen of death. And you'd go look up blue screen of death, and Microsoft wouldn't give you the answer. That's not very helpful. So figure out what your users are calling it. If they call it a spinning beach ball, or a glitch instead of a bug, or a blue screen of death, whatever they're calling it, you have to have that in your index term so they can find it. I once spent a whole summer in 1995 adding meta text to a bunch of pages so that we could sort of fuzz the search engines and get more hits than we legitimately deserved. Anybody ever had that job? It's a terrible job. It was miserable. But it turns out if you're actually providing value by putting in extra terms that are useful to your users, it's a totally ethical and useful way to get people to your site. The thing is, the search engines know when you're being deceptive about it. So if it's not a real term, don't put it on your page. So, analytics part 2. I use Google Analytics on my site, and I don't have it very heavily configured, because all I want to know is, what device are you reading this on? Like, do I need to optimize for phone? Yes, I do. What are you reading? What things should I write more of? Like, my most popular blog post right now is a summary of how women speakers need to think about clothing, because being up on stage with fewer pockets is an actual problem. And why are people bouncing? Is it not giving them the answer that they want? Or is it maybe not Is the page broken? Is there bad advertising? These are all actionable things. I'm not monetizing my blog, but I need to know these things so I can make it better. So many times search engine optimization feels like a scam and a problem, but it doesn't have to be. In an ideal world, it's like super sophisticated indexing. I have a whole mini talk on indexing, and I don't have time to get into it now, but it's really important. So here's the problem search phrase. Here's what somebody enters in a search engine. My wallet doesn't fit in my bike shorts. And right now your site says road ID, identification, tags, dog tags, emergency. You'll notice that there's no overlap between those. So what you have to do is say, why are people searching for wallet doesn't fit in my bike shorts? Well, it's because if I end up as road pizza, I want somebody to be able to call my next of kin and find out what my blood type is. So if you add wallet, biking, sailing, sports, spandex, and reflective, you're going to catch a bigger percentage of the people who have the problem that you are actually solving. Road ID is a real product. I think it's awesome that they have done this, and they're really findable. All right, hands up if you can. Good morning. Put your hands up. All right. Who loves the giant unordered FAQ? What? Amazing. Who believes that the things in a FAQ are actually frequently asked questions? Huh. Who searches inside a FAQ page in the vain hope that eventually they will find an answer because it might be there? Yeah, right? The FAQ page is a cop-out. I know sometimes you need it, but you should know that you are wasting an opportunity to give people a clue about how to use and understand their software. Group your answers in a way that makes it possible for people to find things by serendipity. If one thing doesn't work, maybe the next thing on the list is what they're looking for. Like, say I type Dvorak because I'm a weirdo. Say I'm looking for language keyboard options, right? I'm like, where's my language option? How do I set my keyboard to this? Well, language doesn't have it, but what if keyboard localization is the next answer on the list? Oh, I found it. Suddenly I'm less angry, less frowny face. That's the goal. So I've told you that you need to write things, and I've told you how you're going to get people to find them, but I think I should probably cover how do you actually write a thing, right? And because this is after 2000, which is roughly the break point, we're going to talk about task-based writing, which is to say instructions on how to do one thing. Establish where you are. If somebody has come to you through search, every page is page 1. So you need to tell them where they are before you can tell them where they're going. If they're in configuration, they need to know that. If they're in extra arcane weird steps, they need to know that. It sounds silly to say, here's where you are at the start of every topic if you are writing them all at once. But if you're reading them one at a time, it's totally important. Who knows Carmen Sandiego? Oh, good. So, sometimes I'm like, oh, you sweet young things. So an example page might say, follow these steps after you complete the prerequisites. You need to have a link back to the prerequisites page because people need to have completed that. So when you were playing Where in the World is Carmen Sandiego, you could only find her if you had followed all the other steps to get there. You couldn't just happen upon her. So, give orders. Technically, this is the imperative voice. I think, I didn't have time to look this up, it's also the second person implied object. But you know what? Grammar doesn't matter. What matters is stripping all the politeness and ambiguity out makes it easier to do the thing right now. So if I say, raise your hand, it's more compelling than if I say, please lift your hand in the air. It's just like there's a processing delay there. And you need to think about that. So don't be like, you're not polite in technical writing, you are clear. So how does a user know if they got a task right? Write a unit test. If you can't say at the end of the 5 or 6 steps that you've written, test this by running, or you should see, or something that tells the user they got it right, you're in big trouble because you don't have a task. You have a part of a task or a task and a half, or possibly you have like some steps that are unrelated to anything getting done. But if you can't write a test against it, it's not a task. So every task you write should be testable. If you can't think of a test, it's not a task. It's easy to take things apart, but it's harder to tell if you put them back together correctly. If you disassemble a Rubik's Cube and don't put it back together right, you will never be able to fix it, FYI. So what's next? Once you've answered someone's question, that's great. But this is your one chance to help them a little bit more. If your answer is related to another step, put a link to the next step at the bottom. So you say, great, you've configured your email settings. Click here to go to two-factor authentication. You're giving them a path through, a guide to the flow of your document or your software. You've left them some breadcrumbs that they can choose to follow or not. So the most important part of giving people information is remembering that they're using it to get something done, not that they want to be reading it. So get out of the way. There are a lot more users than there are of you. Do everything that you can to let them own their experience. This is just for Australia. I saw sheep coming into the airport. I was like, oh my gosh, sheep! We have sheep in America too, but it's less exciting. So give the people what they need, when they need it, tell them how they know it worked, and tell them what to do next. That's all you need to be doing for good documentation. So if this was too long for you and you read Twitter instead, answer actual user questions, not the ones you made up on your own, as simply as you can. Make it easy to find the answers. All right, what's my time? Do I have 5 minutes? Okay, I have a video rant. Oh, sorry.
Thank you.
So there are lots of ways people like to consume information. I have personally learned a lot of sewing techniques from watching on YouTube, but you need to calculate how much it's going to cost you to keep it updated. Text you store in Git is very cheap to host and to change, and video requires much more time and attention to alter and update. All of us are more likely to change something that feels unfinished than something that feels polished. And if you want people to keep updating something, you have to make it not look perfect. This is why I use sketchy markup when I'm doing things that are design related. I really like Gorilla for documentation. It's brand new markup-y language, and it lets you pull things in and out of books and create them very simply, and it doesn't feel incredibly polished and like developers are never allowed to touch this. So books that informed this talk, Kathy Sierra's Badass, Making Users Awesome. I think somebody already tweeted about this today because it's that good. Every page is page 1. Scott McCloud's Understanding Comics, which is just core to understanding the whole nature of the web, and The Art of Indexing. You got your pictures? And video credits, and there we go. Thank you. You can find me later in the conference. I think we're pretty much, do we have time?
I think we actually do have about 5 minutes for questions.
Oh, there we go. You can ask questions.
Yes.
I am the pink-haired Mohawk person who is not Sam, so you can track me down that way.
Narrows it down. One I will just to get the floor started. There's a fine line between being direct and being rude. How do you balance that? Like what? I mean, it's sort of an open-ended question, but how do you balance that space between telling someone to do something and being direct and being interpreted as being rude and therefore not welcoming?
So how do you balance between being direct and seeming rude or abrupt or curt? The thing is, rude, which is different than curt, actually takes more words. If you're calling someone names or implying that they're an idiot, it takes longer than just telling them how to do something. So if you find yourself like adding anything about how somebody's an idiot, that's definitely rude. The problem with being curt is that you want the instructions part, like anything that has a number, to be very clear, but you can put some sort of fluffy softening around it, like the introduction. Now we're going to learn how to, if you have new users, which probably as developers, you're not writing for like super end-to-end users, but if you are, you can put a friendly introduction into your steps, but the steps should stay very clean and clear. Does that make sense?
Quick one. What was the name of the markup language you mentioned?
Oh, the markup language, I'm using Balsamic, which is a tool that lets you do like sketchy layouts by dragging them, and it looks hand-drawn. So people will actually comment on it in a way that they won't for...
You mentioned Corella, I think?
Corella is a technical writing tool that it's actually a couple Australians founded it and went and did an incubator in France, and I love the future. And you can Corilla, and you can search on it, and they're out now after a long time in beta, and you should go take a look at it. It's pretty cool.
Thank you.
Hi. If you're constantly adding and polishing to your docs, how do you work out what to cut?
If you are constantly adding and publishing docs, how do you figure out what to cut? I think everything should have an expiration date. I really want someone to write me a wiki modifier that fades things out if they're over a year old. And like if it should expire. I have a whole talk on how data should expire and data should die and we should stop storing it, and how like we're just compulsively hoarding data. And so I think what should happen is when something is over a year old, you should have a programmatic trigger that says, this topic is a year old, is it still correct or should I kill it? And I think that as programmers, you guys could probably figure out how to do that. I haven't yet.
And it's a good thing we've got sprints coming up on Monday and Tuesday, so just hypothetically.
Yes.
Thanks for the talk. What do you think about getting first-time users for an open source project, for example, Django, involved in writing or rewriting existing documentation so it's more or better understandable for beginners that just discovered this new feature as opposed to the developer who came up with this feature?
Right. So it's really important, if you have somebody who's willing to volunteer, to be able to point them at the project clearly. So what you need to do is write a story, just like agile development stories, that say, as a user, I want to understand how to use the flip feature. And then you can hand it off to a relatively new person in the community, and they can take in enough information, but you're still answering one question: how do I use flip?
Thanks.
Hello, thank you for the talk. Do you have any advice for developers who love writing documentation and want to get more into writing technical documentation?
Come to the dark side. If you are a developer who really loves writing documentation, I think that you have a lot of opportunities, and the sneakiest way to do it I've seen is to go in through the API section and say, oh, I'm going to write the API and also the documentation. Oh, and I've written the documentation for the API, so I'm going to do a bunch of stories about how you can use that. And now that we've done a bunch of stories about that, let's do some installation stuff. And you could sort of expand your range that way.
You mentioned a bunch of other talks you've given. I want to see all of them. Where are they?
They are on my website, HeidiWaterhouse.com. It's pretty straightforward. Yes.
All right. With that, thank you very much, Heidi.
Thank you.